The room went silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from respect, the kind that comes from fear. A shy black maid stood in the center of a Korean mafia banquet, surrounded by men who had buried more bodies than secrets. She was there to pour tea, nothing more. But when the chairman's father entered, a man so dangerous even his own son wouldn't sit until he nodded, she did something no one expected. She greeted him. In Busan Dialect, a dialect so old, so sacred, it died with a bloodline massacre 50 years ago. Chopsticks froze midair. Breathing stopped. Grown men who feared nothing suddenly feared a dead language spoken by a living ghost. Because she spoke like royalty, like family, like someone who wasn't supposed to exist. And in that moment, she realized this wasn't a job anymore. This was survival. Who is this woman? Not who she appears to be, a maid, invisible, temporary, but who she really is. A woman who carries in her voice the weight of a bloodline that was supposed to end 50 years ago. This isn't a story about a job. It's not even a story about romance, though love runs through it like a river underground. This is a story about memory, how it survives, how it travels across oceans and generations, how it destroys the lies we tell to protect ourselves. Because some truths don't need violence to dismantle empires. Some truths just need a voice. That night, in a room built on silence and fear, the past found its voice. And the chairman's father didn't freeze because she was rude. He froze because she was impossible. The dialect she spoke, the way she shaped the words, the rhythm of the phrasing, the particular melody that belonged to a specific time and place meant one of two things. Either someone had lied to him for 50 years, or someone he thought was dead had been alive all along. So the question isn't just who she is. The question is, what happens when the truth you buried comes back? Speaking the language of the woman you loved and lost a lifetime ago. What happens when the past refuses to stay silent? Her name was Amahle. It means the beautiful ones in Zulu. Her grandmother gave her that name the day she was born. In a small coastal town so far from Korea, it might as well have been another world. And yet, Korea was all her grandmother ever talked about. Not the Korea you see in dramas. Not the Korea of neon lights and pop music. The Korea of before. The Korea of war. Ships disappearing in the night, and promises broken by men who wore power like armor. Amahle grew up between worlds. She had her grandmother's wide smile and her mother's quiet strength, but she belonged nowhere completely. The kids at school couldn't pronounce her name. The neighbors asked why her grandmother spoke a language no one else understood. And her grandmother, for all her stories, never explained why she'd left Korea or why she'd never gone back. She just said over and over, like a prayer she couldn't stop saying, "Some doors, once you close them, you don't open again. Not in this lifetime." Every night after dinner, her grandmother would sit by the window and tell stories. Stories of a city called Busan, where the ocean met the mountains and the air smelled like salt and grilled fish. Stories of war, when the streets ran red and families were torn apart by borders drawn on maps by men who had never set foot in Korea. Stories of betrayal, of women left behind, of children who grew up never knowing their fathers' names. And woven through all of it, like a thread Amahle didn't understand until much later, were stories of love. A love her grandmother never named, but spoke of in a voice so soft it sounded like mourning. Amahle didn't learn Korean from a textbook. She learned it the way children learn prayers, by repetition, by ritual, by listening to her grandmother speak to ghosts in the dark. But it wasn't modern Korean. It was old Korean, pre-war Korean, the kind spoken by people who had lived through things textbooks didn't record, honorifics that no longer existed, proverbs that had died with the generation that spoke them, phrases so specific, so rooted in a particular time and place that only someone who had lived in Busan before the war would recognize them. Language isn't just words, Amahle, her grandmother used to say. Language is memory. It's how the dead speak to the living. Forget the language, and you forget the people. Forget the people, and what happened to them happens again. Amahle didn't understand. Not then. She just knew that when her grandmother spoke Korean, the air grew heavy, as if holding its breath. When Amahle was 19, her grandmother began to fade. Not suddenly, nothing about her grandmother was sudden. It was the kind of slow, quiet, diminishing that happens when someone has carried a weight for too long and finally decides to put it down. In those last weeks, she stopped eating, stopped leaving her room, but she kept talking. In Korean. Always in Korean. She would hold Amahle's hand, her grip still strong, still certain, and whisper things Amahle didn't fully understand. Names she'd never heard. Dates that meant nothing. Apologies to people who weren't in the room. And one phrase, repeated over and over, until her voice gave out entirely. Tell him I kept my promise. Tell him she lived. Amahle never found out who he was, or who she was. Her grandmother took those answers with her, taking her last breath on a Tuesday morning while Amahle was holding her hand, and the room smelled like the incense her grandmother had burned every night since Amahle could remember. For the first time in her life, Amahle was completely, unbearably alone. The inheritance her grandmother left wasn't money. It was a language, a set of stories with missing endings, and a quiet, unshakable feeling that there was something unfinished, something her grandmother had been running from her whole life. But Amahle had bills to pay, rent to cover, dreams that required money she didn't have. So she did what thousands of young people do when they need work and have no clear path. She went abroad. She went to South Korea. Not because she spoke the language, not really. Not in any way that would help her get hired. Not because she had family there. But because the job agencies promised good pay, room and board, and a chance to send money home. She thought it would be temporary. A year, maybe two. Just long enough to save, to figure out her next move. She didn't expect to end up working in a house built on secrets. The job was simple. Housekeeping, cleaning, laundry, occasionally serving tea when guests visited. The rules were even simpler. Keep your eyes down. Speak only when spoken to. Don't ask questions. Don't linger in rooms where conversations are happening. And above all, never, ever acknowledge anything you overhear. Amahle learned quickly that Chairman Kang's household was not a home. It was a fortress. The kind of place where every room had a purpose, every conversation had weight, and every person from the guards at the gate to the cook in the kitchen knew their role and stayed in it. She learned to move through the house like a shadow, invisible, efficient, forgotten the moment she left a room. And for months, that was enough. Until it wasn't. Before that night, there were small moments. Moments she didn't understand at the time. Like the day she was cleaning the chairman's study and saw a photograph on his desk. An old photograph, black and white, edges worn from handling. A young man in a military uniform standing beside a woman in a traditional hanbok. The woman's face was turned slightly away from the camera, but Amahle could see her smile. It was the kind of smile that carried sadness in it, the kind of smile her grandmother used to have. She didn't think much of it at first. Old men keep old photographs. That's what old men do. But when she moved to dust the frame, the chairman walked in. He didn't yell. He didn't scold. He just stood there, staring at the photograph in her hand. And for a moment, just a fraction of a second, Amahle saw something break in his face. Then he took the photograph from her, set it back on the desk, and said in Korean, slow and deliberate, "Some things are not meant to be touched." She nodded, apologized, left the room. But she couldn't shake what she'd seen. Not the photograph itself, though the woman's smile had looked strangely familiar. No, it was the smell, old incense, faded perfume, the exact smell that used to cling to her grandmother's clothes, that lived in the folds of her grandmother's hanbok that Amahle still kept in a box under her bed. And later that night, lying in her small room near the kitchen, Amahle realized why the woman's smile had looked familiar. She'd seen it before, not in a photograph, in a mirror. The banquet was announced a week in advance. It wasn't a celebration. It was a ritual, a passing of power from the old generation to the new. Chairman Kang's father was coming. The man they called the Patriarch. The man who had built the empire before his son inherited it. The man whose name was spoken in whispers, even by people who feared nothing. The house was cleaned top to bottom, every surface polished until it reflected light, every dish prepared with a kind of precision reserved for kings. The staff was told to stay invisible, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to move like ghosts. Amahle had served at gatherings before, but never one like this. The air itself felt different, tense, dangerous, like the moment before lightning strikes. The dining hall was transformed. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting fractured light across the long mahogany table. The cigarette smoke that would come later would cling to the air, bitter and blue, a warning that never left. The guests arrived, one by one. Men in tailored suits with faces carved from stone. Men who had made fortunes in industries no one spoke about openly. Politicians who smiled for cameras by day and bowed to criminals by night. And at the head of the table, an empty chair. The chair reserved for the Patriarch. No one sat until he arrived. No one even looked at it directly. It was as if the chair itself held power. Amahle stood near the wall, hands folded, eyes down, waiting for her cue to pour tea. She had done this 100 times. She knew the rhythm, the silence, the unspoken rules. But tonight, the silence felt heavier, like the room was holding its breath. Then the door opened. Every man in the room stood, not quickly, not casually, with the kind of synchronized reverence you only see in the presence of someone who has taken lives and gotten away with it. The Patriarch was old, not frail, not weak, old in the way mountains are, old, solid, immovable, carved by time and violence into something that couldn't be ignored. His cane tapped against marble, a rhythm like a countdown. Chairman Kang stepped forward, bowed deeply, gestured to the chair. The Patriarch sat. Only then did everyone else sit. Amahle's cue came. She stepped forward with the teapot, hands steady, heart racing. This was her role. Pour the tea, step back, disappear. One foot in front of the other, the weight of the silver teapot familiar in her hands, the heat of it radiating through the handle, 20 feet to the head of the table, 15, 10. As she approached, the Patriarch muttered something under his breath. In Busan Dialect. A dismissive comment. Something about the help these days, the words shaped in a way Amahle's ears recognized before her mind did. The exact intonation her grandmother used when she was annoyed. The particular rhythm that belonged to a specific neighborhood in a specific time. And Amahle, without thinking, without planning, without even realizing what she was doing, answered him. In Busan Dialect. Flawless, instinctive, as natural as breathing. 어서 오십시오, 회장님. 먼 길 오셨습니다. Welcome home, Chairman. You've come a long way. But not just the words, the way she said them, the old form of address, the specific honorific that had died with his generation. The particular melody of the phrase, not Seoul Korean, not modern Korean, but Busan Korean from before the war, the Korean of his youth, the Korean of his mother, the Korean of a woman he'd loved and lost. The room stopped breathing. Chopsticks froze midair, suspended like the cigarette smoke. A glass trembled in someone's hand. Amahle could hear the ice rattling against crystal. Someone's chair scraped against the floor. The sound too loud in the terrible silence. The Patriarch went completely still. He didn't turn to look at her right away. He just sat there, staring at the table, as if the words she'd spoken had reached into his chest and stopped his heart. Silence. The terrible kind. The kind that precedes violence or revelation or both. Then, slowly, so slowly, it felt like watching a statue come to life. He turned his head and looked at her. Not the way you look at a maid, not the way you look at a stranger, the way you look at a ghost. His eyes scanned her face, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her mouth, the way she held her shoulders. The teapot in her hands the same way, she suddenly realized, as the woman in the photograph had held a kettle in a kitchen 50 years ago. For 3 seconds, maybe 5, the most powerful man in the room looked at a 23-year-old maid as if she held a knife to his throat. Then he spoke. In Busan dialect. Not modern Korean, not formal. The kind of question only someone from a specific family, in a specific time, would ask. A question that had an answer only one woman in the world should know. 할머니께서 무슨 노래를 부르셨습니까? What song did your grandmother sing? One of the men at the table leaned forward, whispered something urgent to Chairman Kang. Another man's hand moved toward his jacket, not for a weapon, but for permission. Waiting, watching. The Patriarch raised one hand, a single gesture. The room obeyed. No one moved. No one spoke. Amahle's mouth went dry. Because she knew this song. She'd heard it every night of her childhood. Her grandmother's lullaby. A song about a girl who waited by the sea for a lover who never returned. She could lie. Say she didn't understand. Pour the tea and disappear and let this moment pass like smoke. Her grandmother's voice in her memory. Some doors, once you close them, you don't open again. But her grandmother had also said, language is how the dead speak to the living. And Amahle realized her grandmother had given her this language for a reason, had taught her these words, this dialect, these songs, knowing that someday, somewhere, someone would ask. This was that moment. She answered, Badai Nore, the song of the sea. And then, because the room was silent, and because her grandmother's voice was so clear in her memory that it felt like she was standing right behind her, Amahle sang the first line. Quietly, shakily, but perfectly. The melody was old, older than the war, older than the violence that had scattered families across oceans. It was the kind of song that carried in it the weight of waiting, of separation, of love that survives distance and death and silence. The Patriarch's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Something old and buried and dangerous. Something like recognition. Something like grief. He nodded once, small, almost imperceptible. Then he turned back to the table and said, in a voice that carried no emotion, "Ganyonan namnanda." She stays. 2 words, but they changed everything. Because she stays didn't mean she could keep working. It meant she was under his protection, under his observation, under his control. And in that moment, Amahle realized this wasn't a job anymore. This was survival. The rest of the banquet passed in a blur. She poured tea, cleared plates, followed orders. But every eye in the room tracked her. Every conversation paused when she came near. The air felt heavier, charged with something electric and dangerous. And when the Patriarch left, he stopped at the door, turned back, and looked at her one last time. Not with anger, not with fear, with something worse. Recognition. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The next morning, Amahle woke up in a different room. Not her small quarters near the kitchen, a guest room, larger, cleaner, with a lock on the outside. She wasn't told why. She wasn't given a choice. She was just moved. And when she tried to leave, a guard outside her door politely but firmly suggested she wait for instructions. The message was clear. She wasn't fired. She wasn't free. She was something else now. Something they hadn't decided how to deal with yet. Over the next 3 days, men came to test her. Not with violence, with language. They would walk past her in the hallway and mutter old proverbs in Busan dialect, phrases about loyalty, about family, about keeping secrets buried where they belong. And every time, Amahle answered. Not because she wanted to, but because her grandmother's voice was so deeply embedded in her memory that responding felt as automatic as breathing. She didn't just answer correctly. She added context, variations, phrases no outsider should know, idioms that hadn't been spoken in decades. And each time she did, the men exchanged glances, nervous glances, the kind of glances people exchange when they realize they're standing on ground that might collapse. Chairman Kang's son, a man in his 40s with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, tried to replicate her accent. He had been raised speaking Korean. He had studied in Seoul. He had lived his entire life immersed in the language. But when he tried to speak the way Amahle spoke, the way his grandfather spoke, he couldn't. The tones were wrong. The rhythm was off. It was like trying to play a song you'd only read about but never heard. And that terrified him. Because if she could speak like family, if she knew things only family should know, then one of two things was true. Either someone inside the family had betrayed them, or she was family. And both options were dangerous. The orders came down from the Patriarch himself. Keep her close, not as a maid, as a translator, as a bridge to a past most of the younger generation had never accessed. She was given new clothes, not uniforms, simple but elegant dresses. She was told to attend meetings, to sit quietly in the corner, to listen. And when the old men spoke in dialects too old for the younger generation to fully understand, she was asked to clarify, to translate, to explain. It sounded like an honor. It felt like a cage. Because everywhere she went, guards followed. 2 men, always 2. They didn't speak to her. They didn't threaten her. They just watched. Every step, every conversation, every breath. Protection, they called it. But Amahle knew better. This wasn't protection. This was containment. And then the attempt happened. It was during a business meeting at a hotel downtown. The Patriarch was meeting with representatives from a rival faction. Old grudges, old debts. The kind of meeting where everyone smiles and no one trusts anyone. Amahle was there, sitting in the corner, translating when needed. Invisible again, in the way that only women in certain spaces can be. The gunman came through the service entrance. He didn't get far. The Patriarch's guards were faster, but the message was sent. Someone wanted him dead, and someone knew his schedule. The Patriarch survived, but the fallout was immediate. Amahle was moved again, this time to a safe house. No explanation, no warning, just 2 guards, a car with tinted windows, and a building she'd never seen before. She was questioned, not harshly, but thoroughly. Who had she spoken to? Who had she told about the meetings? Did she recognize anyone unusual at the hotel? She answered honestly. She had spoken to no one. She had told no one. She had noticed nothing. But the questions kept coming. And Amahle began to realize something. They didn't think she was the threat. They thought she was the target. Because if rival factions knew about her, if they knew she could access the Patriarch in ways even his own family couldn't, then she was leverage. She was a weakness. And weaknesses, in that world, didn't survive long. The internal struggle was constant. Every word she spoke carried weight she didn't ask for. Every silence felt like a decision with consequences she couldn't predict. She wanted to leave, to disappear, to go back to being invisible. But she couldn't. Because the moment she'd answered that greeting, she'd opened a door, and the truth waiting on the other side was bigger than her. Bigger than the Patriarch. Bigger than the empire he'd built. She knew the truth she carried could burn everything, including herself. And she didn't know if she was brave enough to light the match, or smart enough to walk away. On the 7th day, the Patriarch requested to see her. Alone. No guards, no translators, no witnesses, just the 2 of them, in a room with walls thick enough to swallow sound. Amahle's hands didn't shake as she walked in, but her heart was screaming. She had learned, in the weeks since the banquet, that silence in that house was never neutral. Silence was strategy. And this silence felt like the kind that came before confessions. Or executions. The Patriarch sat in a chair near the window, his back to her, staring out at the city below. He didn't turn when she entered. He just spoke. In Busan dialect, soft, almost gentle. "Sit," he said. She sat. He asked her a question, not about the attempt on his life, not about her loyalty, a question so specific, so intimate, that only one woman in the world should have known the answer. What did she sing to you when you couldn't sleep? Amahle's breath caught. Because her grandmother had sung to her every night, a lullaby in Korean, old Korean, a song about a girl who waited by the sea for a lover who never returned. A song her grandmother said her own mother had sung to her. Amahle answered. She sang the first verse, quietly, shakily, but correctly. The Patriarch's shoulders dropped, not in relief, in something heavier, grief, maybe, or recognition. He turned to face her. And for the first time, Amahle saw past the power, past the empire, past the man who had ordered deaths and built fortunes on blood. She saw an old man, tired, haunted, carrying a weight he'd never been able to put down. "You look like her," he said. Not angry, not accusing, just stating a fact. Your eyes, your hands, the way you hold your head when you're trying not to cry. Amahle didn't ask who her was. She already knew. The Patriarch began to speak, and the truth unfolded like a funeral cloth, slowly, carefully, revealing something that had been wrapped tight for decades. There had been a massacre during the war, not the kind written about in history books, the kind buried in unmarked graves and erased from official records. A village near Busan, fishermen, farmers, families who had nothing to do with the war except that they lived in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Patriarch had been a young man then, a soldier, not by choice, but by circumstance. And in that village, he had met a woman. Beautiful, strong, the kind of woman who could gut a fish with one hand and recite poetry with the other. He fell in love, fast, hard, the kind of love that makes young men do foolish things, like promise forever in a world where tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. But she wasn't Korean. Not fully. Her mother had come from somewhere else, somewhere far, somewhere that made her different in a country that didn't forgive difference easily. And his family, old blood, old power, old prejudice, forbade it. They told him to walk away, to forget her, to marry someone appropriate, someone who could carry the family name without shame. He refused. For a while, he tried to fight for her, to protect her, to build a life that could hold both love and legacy. But then the massacre happened, and the world made the choice for him. The village was burned, the people scattered. Some fled north, some fled south, some just disappeared. His family used the chaos to separate them. They told him she was dead, killed in the massacre. They even showed him a body, a woman, burned beyond recognition. They held a funeral, made him attend, made him grieve. And he believed them. Because why wouldn't he? But she wasn't dead. She was pregnant with his child. And his family knew. They smuggled her out, paid her to disappear, told her if she ever came back, if she ever spoke his name, if she ever tried to claim the child as his, they would finish what the massacre started. So she ran, far, across oceans, across continents, to a place where no one knew her name or her story. And she raised a daughter, alone, in silence. A daughter who grew up and had a daughter of her own. A daughter named Amahle. The Patriarch's voice cracked. Not much, just enough to show that underneath the armor, there was still something human. She kept her promise, he said. She never came back. She never spoke my name. She disappeared so completely that even I believed the lie." He looked at Amahle, really looked at her. "But she didn't forget, did she?" Amahle shook her head. "No, she didn't forget. She told me stories every night. About Busan, about the sea, about a man she loved who she said was stolen from her. She never said your name, but she taught me your language, your phrases, your world. She said language was memory, and memory was the only thing they couldn't take from her." The Patriarch stood, slowly, painfully. He walked to a cabinet, pulled out an old wooden box, and opened it. Inside was a photograph. The same photograph Amahle had seen on Chairman Kang's desk. The young soldier, the woman in the hanbok. He handed it to her. "That's her. That's your grandmother. And that's me, 50 years ago, before the world took everything." Amahle stared at the photograph, at the woman's smile, the same smile she'd seen in mirrors her whole life, the same smile her mother had, the same smile that carried sadness like a second language. The Patriarch sat back down. "The greeting you gave me that night, it wasn't just respectful, it was specific. It was the greeting she used to give my father, the exact phrasing, the exact tone. No one else knew that. No one else could have taught you that, except her." He paused. "You're my granddaughter." The room went silent. Not the silence of fear, the silence of truth finally being spoken aloud after decades of being buried. Amahle sat in silence. Granddaughter. The word felt too big, too heavy, too late. Because what did it mean, really? That she carried his blood? That explained the dialect, the recognition, the way the photograph had smelled like her grandmother's clothes. But it didn't explain why her grandmother had spent 60 years in exile. Why she died alone, holding on to a language no one else spoke, singing songs to a granddaughter who didn't understand their significance until it was too late. It didn't explain why he, this man, her grandfather, had let it happen. "She kept her promise," the Patriarch said again, as if reading her thoughts. "She never came back. She never spoke my name. She disappeared so completely that even I believed the lie." "But you didn't look for her." Amale's voice came out harder than she intended. "When the war ended, when things settled, you didn't look." The Patriarch's face hardened. "I thought she was dead." "You were told she was dead. That's not the same as knowing." Silence. "You're right," he said finally. "I didn't look, because part of me didn't want to know. Because if she was alive and hadn't come back, it meant she'd chosen to leave. And that was harder to bear than death." Amahle stared at him, at this old man who'd built an empire on violence and silence, and the graves of people who'd known too much. "She didn't choose to leave," Amahle said quietly. "She was driven out, by your family, by the same people who are probably deciding right now what to do with me." The Patriarch didn't deny it. Amahle felt something break inside her chest. Not pain, release. Because for the first time in her life, the pieces made sense. The stories, the language, the weight her grandmother carried. It wasn't shame. It wasn't regret. It was love. A love so big it survived war, distance, death, and silence. Some secrets don't die with the people who keep them. Some secrets wait, patient, quiet, until the right voice speaks them back into existence. And Amahle realized, sitting in that room, that she was that voice. Not by choice, by inheritance. The Patriarch offered her everything. Money, enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Protection, a team of guards, a new identity if she wanted it. Safety in a world that didn't offer safety to people like her. A restored name, a place in the family, official recognition, papers, records, everything her grandmother had been denied. He laid it all out like a contract, calm, measured, businesslike, as if love and blood and 50 years of buried truth could be solved with logistics. Amahle listened. And then she said no. The Patriarch blinked, as if he'd misheard. No? No, she repeated, in Busan dialect. Clear, firm, final. I don't want your money. I don't want your protection. I don't want a place in a family that erased my grandmother like she never existed. The Patriarch's face hardened, not with anger, with confusion, because in his world, everyone had a price. Everyone wanted something: power, security, legacy, and he was offering all of it. Then what do you want? He asked. I want the truth, Amahle said. I want records unlocked. I want the witnesses who are still alive to speak. I want my grandmother's story told, not hidden, not bought, told, so that everyone knows she wasn't a mistake. She wasn't a shame. She was a woman who loved you, and you loved her, and your family chose power over her life. The Patriarch stood slowly, the way powerful men stand when they're about to remind you who controls the room. You don't understand what you're asking, he said. That story doesn't just hurt me. It destabilizes everything. The family, the business, the alliances we've built over decades. You expose that, and you expose fractures, weaknesses. Rivals will move. Blood will spill. People will die. People already died, Amahle said. A whole village. And my grandmother spent her entire life running from the lie your family told. So forgive me if I don't care about your empire's stability. The Patriarch's jaw tightened. Do you know what it's like to build something from nothing? To create order from chaos? To make a world where your family is safe? Do you know what it's like? Amahle countered, her voice rising. To grow up with a grandmother who cried every night in a language you didn't understand? To watch her die apologizing to ghosts? To inherit a story with no ending because the man who knew the truth chose silence over love? The Patriarch flinched, actually flinched. You'll destroy everything I built, he said. Amahle met his eyes, and in Busan dialect, slow and deliberate, she said, You already destroyed everything that mattered. The room went still, because that sentence, in that dialect, carried a weight that translation couldn't touch. It wasn't just accusation, it was verdict. The Patriarch stared at her, and for the first time in 50 years, the most powerful man in the room had no answer. Because she was right. He had built an empire, but he'd built it on silence, on erasure, on the grave of a woman he'd loved and a child he'd never known. And no amount of money or power could undo that. Amahle stood. I'm not here to destroy you, she said quietly. I'm here to finish what my grandmother couldn't. She kept her promise. She stayed silent. She disappeared. She protected you even when you didn't protect her. But I didn't make that promise, and I won't. The Patriarch sank back into his chair, not defeated, but cornered by the one thing he'd never been able to control: memory. If I let you do this, he said slowly, it won't just be my name that suffers. It'll be yours too. They'll call you a liar, a con artist. They'll say you're after money, after power. They'll destroy you. Amahle smiled, small, sad. Let them try. I've been invisible my whole life. I'm used to it. And she turned to leave. The Patriarch called after her. She really never stopped loving me, did she? Amahle stopped at the door, didn't turn around. No, she didn't. And that's the saddest part of this whole story. She paused. Because you had a choice. You could have looked for her. You could have questioned the lie. You could have chosen love over empire. But you didn't. And she spent 60 years waiting for a man who never came, singing songs to ghosts, teaching her granddaughter a language of a home she could never return to. Amahle turned back to face him one last time. So no, I don't want your money. I don't want your name. I don't want anything from you except the truth. Because that's the only thing you have left to give that's worth anything. 2 weeks later, Amahle stood in front of a room full of people. Journalists, historians, community leaders, family members who had been told lies their whole lives, representatives from organizations that documented war crimes and historical injustices. She wore the same maid's uniform she'd been wearing the night of the banquet, not because she had to, but because she wanted them to see her exactly as she was. Not royalty, not power. Just a woman with a story that refused to stay buried. The room was packed, standing room only, cameras at the back, recording everything. Amahle didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She simply told the story. In Busan Dialect first, then in Korean, then in English. She told them about the village, about the massacre, about a woman who was loved and erased in the same breath, about a child born in secret, about a family that chose power over truth, and about a grandmother who carried that silence across oceans and decades until her dying breath. She showed them the photograph, the one the Patriarch had given her, the young soldier and the woman in the hanbok. She played a recording she'd made of herself singing the lullaby, her grandmother's lullaby, the same melody the Patriarch had recognized that night at the banquet. She presented documents, records she'd found with help from historians and activists, birth certificates, immigration papers, letters her grandmother had kept, written in Korean, that she'd never sent. Evidence of a life lived in exile. Evidence of a love that survived everything except the truth. The room listened. Not because Amahle demanded it, but because the past finally had a voice. And once the past starts speaking, it's very hard to make it stop. She spoke for 40 minutes. Her voice never wavered. Her hands never shook. And when she was done, she said simply, "My grandmother's name was Min So. She was 22 when they told her to disappear. She was 83 when she died. She spent 61 years in exile. And the only thing she wanted, the only thing she ever asked for was for someone to remember, not who she was to him, but who she was. A woman, a mother, a survivor. Someone who loved and lost and kept living anyway." Amahle paused. "I'm here because she can't be. I'm speaking because she was silenced. And I'm telling the story because silence is how these things happen again." The Patriarch sat in the back of the room, silent, watching. His face was unreadable, but he didn't leave. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. As the truth he'd spent 50 years burying was spoken aloud by the granddaughter he'd never known he had. When Amahle finished, the room erupted. Questions, demands for evidence, skepticism, support, anger, tears, chaos. Reporters shouted over each other. Family members argued amongst themselves. Historians conferred in corners, checking documents, verifying timelines. But Amahle didn't stay to manage it. She'd done what she came to do. She walked out of the building, still dressed as a maid, and no one stopped her. But this time, everyone saw her. Records were opened. Witnesses came forward. People who had been silent for decades suddenly found their voices. The story spread, not as scandal, as history, as correction, as the kind of truth that doesn't ask for permission to exist. News outlets picked it up. Documentaries were commissioned. Survivors of the massacre, those who were still alive, began to speak about what had happened, about the families torn apart, about the cover-ups, about the lies. The Patriarch's empire didn't fall, but it changed. Some of his allies distanced themselves. Some of his rivals saw weakness and moved. Some of his own family demanded accountability. But some also demanded change. Chairman Kang, Amahle's uncle, though he'd never acknowledged it publicly, quietly funded initiatives to document the massacre, to identify the dead, to bring closure to families who'd been waiting for answers for 50 years. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. Amahle left the estate that same day. She didn't take the money. She didn't take the name. She just left. And as she walked down the long driveway, past the guards, past the gates, past the world that had tried to contain her, the Patriarch stood at the window and watched. He whispered something to himself, so quietly that no one else heard. Some ghosts don't haunt. Some come back to finish what was broken. He stood there long after she disappeared from view. And for the first time in 50 years, he let himself cry. Power doesn't always rule. Sometimes it remembers. Amahle understood something most people never learn. The quietest voices can carry the heaviest truths. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need to destroy the empire or humiliate the family. She needed recognition. She needed the world to know that her grandmother had existed, had loved, had mattered. And in giving her grandmother a voice, she gave herself one too. Because that's what inheritance really is. Not money, not titles, not even blood. It's memory, it's language, it's the stories we carry and the courage we find to speak them. Her grandmother had run, had stayed silent, had protected a man who hadn't protected her. But Amahle didn't have to. She could speak. She could finish what her grandmother started. She could turn silence into sound. And that, in the end, was the only power that mattered. 6 months later, Amahle received a letter. No return address, but she recognized the handwriting on the envelope. Old-fashioned, precise, the same style she'd seen on documents from the Patriarch's office. Inside was a single photograph. The Patriarch, much younger, maybe in his 30s, standing in front of a grave. A simple stone marker. No name. Just coordinates that Amahle realized, after some research, corresponded to a small cemetery near Busan. On the back of the photograph, written in Busan Dialect, "I found her. I'm sorry it took so long." Amahle kept the photograph, added it to the box where she kept her grandmother's things. The hanbok, the letters, the photograph of the young soldier and the woman in traditional dress. A collection of fragments, of a life lived in pieces, of love that survived everything. And someday, when she had a daughter of her own, she would tell her this story. In Korean, in Busan Dialect, in the language of memory. So that the dead could speak to the living. So that what happened would not be forgotten. So that silence would never again be mistaken for peace. What would you have done in her place? Would you have taken the money and protection, or chosen truth at any cost? Drop your answer in the comments. If this story moved you, subscribe, because we have more stories that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Stories about love, power, identity, and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. And if you think this one was unforgettable, wait till you hear what's coming next.